Well, good evening, guys. Now listen, fellas. I'm going to say the same thing I say to my church when I preach on Sunday mornings, okay? You can fall asleep as I get into the sermon, but as we start, if we could be awake, I like to know. So let's try again. Good evening, guys. There you go. At least I got you awake now. We'll get rolling. And I know it's hard. You're kind of set up for failure because that meal was amazing. And those rolls alone, I mean, I'm ready to go to sleep and for a nap. So if I fall asleep, Mike, just throw something at me. But I'm honored to be here with you guys tonight. I feel very special to get to kind of meet some of you guys that I've never met. I've been in the area for quite a while now. I'm under a little pressure because two of my mountain preaching buddies are here with me. I got Gerald Holly and Palma was at Elk Park before I was, and so they might be grading me at the end. I don't know, but I appreciate them being here as well, and it's good to get to know many of you this evening. As we get started, Mike introduced me a little bit, but I want to tell you just a couple of other interesting facts about me. At least I find them interesting. You can laugh if they're not. But one of the big things that you should probably know about me is I come from a line of people in ministry. My uncle was in ministry. My grandfather was in ministry. My great-grandfather was in ministry. And my father was a Christian camp manager for 32 years up near Richmond, Virginia. So I grew up a camp kid, okay? And as Mike said, I decided to get out of Richmond as fast as I could. I heard they had really good sweet tea down here, so I made my way down here, went to Milligan College, and stuck around after I married a wonderful Elizabethan girl, and her name's Meg. She is a teacher at Elizabethan High School, and we've got two little kids, and they just keep us hopping all the time. And I'll tell you, one of the things I enjoyed in my experience kind of coming up through ministry was my time at my dad's camp. It meant a lot to me. I loved the outdoors. That's another thing you ought to know about me. I love to be outside. I love to hike, love to camp, love to do all that stuff. But also, because I was a camp guy and I loved camp, when I moved down here, Aaron, over at the camp, found out that I was a camp kid. And the problem with liking the outdoors and liking camp is you will become a quick candidate to be a dean for camp. And if you've ever been a dean, it is a lot of stress, but at this point I had done camp several times, and so I loved it. And I've done it for years, and I love doing the wilderness thing because, you always got to do something new and adventurous, which was great. Until I realized that I may not be as adventurous as I used to be. I lead the wilderness camp, or did up until a couple of years ago. Did that for about 3 or 4 years. And I love doing the wilderness stuff because it's kind of new stuff every day. You get challenged and you get pushed a little bit. And one of the things that we do is we go whitewater rafting, we go rock climbing, we go cave crawling. We do all kinds of stuff throughout the week. And all of that is great. It's wonderful. But I'll tell you, at the end of my first year, after I had pushed all these high schoolers to try to do that, we came to kind of the celebratory moment. It was the last activity. And we were going to go zip lining at what I'm told is one of the longest zip lines in the East Coast, and it's actually over near Bluff City. It's an outdoor adventures place. And we were going to end the week that way. And so we're all talking about the week. We're headed up to the zip line, and I didn't notice we were kind of going higher and higher and higher on this mountain. And we're all talking about how great it was and how God really came out, and some of us got pushed beyond our limits, and the kids were so excited about it. And I was feeling pretty good about things. I was like, wow, we created just a wonderful experience this week. And as the truck stopped, it stopped right at a platform, and I thought, oh, this is neat. This is probably where you get up and you take the stairs, and then you go zip lining from tree to tree. No, what I did is I stepped out on the platform and I realized there was nothing but a cliff underneath me, and the zip line went out over the gorge. Had no idea. Now, like I said, I'm adventurous, but my body at that moment told me I was getting quite a bit older. Quite a bit older. Anybody here ever had their body tell them it's getting older? Yeah, some amens in the audience. Yeah, and not the mind. The mind might feel good, but the body, no. And so all of a sudden this started happening. And I couldn't control it whatsoever. I felt like a fool. I couldn't stop this. I love adventure. But here I am looking at this thing, and my body is overcome with so much fear. I'm trembling, and I've never experienced this before. And all the students, they're cheering me on. They're excited. You can do this. Come on, Grant, show us how to do it. And I'm thinking, yeah, I can do it. And I do this all the way down to the floor. and I can't move. I was literally crippled by my fear in that moment. And I kind of felt like I was letting the students down. And one student in particular said something to me, and it stuck with me. It was like a knife through the heart. He said, here you have been pushing us to our limits all week. And look at you now. That cut deep. Cut real deep. I thought, wow, we had this great week, and I can't even do what I've been pushing them to do all week. You ever had a moment like that? A moment where you have been so overcome with fear that you can't even control your body. Or maybe your mind. Maybe you've had a moment like that, or maybe you can't think of one, but I'll say this, as a nation and as a world, I think we just came through some fearful stuff. A lot of people that didn't know what to do. As churches, we were trying to figure it out. What's next? Where do we go forward? Is this fearful? Is this faithful? Constant kind of back and forth, but fear really had a hold on things. And when you experience fear like that, it's something like nothing else. But you know what's interesting? Not only can that happen to us physically, but can it happen to us spiritually? You ever had something so fearful in your spiritual life that you felt like freezing up? And maybe it was that moment when God first called you and you didn't know what to do. When He called you into that relationship. Or maybe when it's something like He introduced you to somebody new. He said, why don't you go invite them to church? Why don't you tell them about me? And that fear just kind of picked up and increased. Or maybe it was even in a time when He asked you to give financially and you just thought, how am I going to pay the bills at the end of the month? You know, Mike said that we were going to be talking about Haggai, and I got to tell you, one of the things as I look at the book of Haggai, there's a lot of different themes you can look at with all the minor prophets. There's a lot of different things you can see. But one of the things I see that stands out very clearly in that book and of this minor prophet is the theme of fear and the power it can have. And the reason that I mention that is because if you start to look at the book, you'll notice very quickly that the Israelites were still in a fearful moment. A very fearful moment. They didn't know what was next. They had just come out of the Babylonian exile. And if you look at the timeline and we get the context of Haggai, one of the things you'll notice is that he came about during the time of King Darius. And that's after the exile, after Cyrus has released them and told them they can go back. Now some did, some didn't, again because of fear. And as they go back, you know, they have some plans and ideas of maybe what they should be doing, but God has given them some specific instructions. You know, He's led them to go back and He wants them to build the temple, kind of the centerpiece of that community of His people. He wants it rebuilt since it was destroyed during the exile. And another thing that's interesting is during that time, this is before Nehemiah, about 100 years before Nehemiah comes back and builds the wall, but yet there were still some things God was calling them to do. And so as we look at our timeline, you have Haggai in that period, but then Nehemiah comes later. But this book seems to be drenched in some actions related to fear. And a lot of times with the prophets, they are asked to speak on behalf of God. God gives them a message for the people, and it's not necessarily futuristic, but it is a prophecy for that time. And one of the things that's happening is God is calling His people back, and He's almost correcting them through Haggai. Now, if you've got your Bibles with you tonight, I want you to follow along. I'm going to have it on the screen as well, but I'm a guy that I like to still use the Bible and hand, because you never know, so many translations and things that are out there. There may be things that you may miss. And for example, we're going to start in 3rd Haggai tonight. Everybody go ahead and turn to 3rd Haggai, if you would. Okay, some people are paying attention. All right, just making sure. All right, 2 chapters of Haggai. As we look at this short book, it sounds like he just barely beat out Obadiah, so that's good. As we go to Haggai, here's what we want to notice just at the beginning, right off the back, what God is calling these people to. He says, in the 2nd year of King Darius, on the 1st day of the 6th month, the word of the Lord came through the prophet Haggai to Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and Joshua, son of Jozadak, the high priest. This is what the Lord Almighty said. These people say, the time has not yet come to rebuild the Lord's house. Then the word of the Lord came through the prophet Haggai. Is it a time for you yourself to be living in your paneled houses while this house remains a ruin? It's interesting when I read this because it makes me think of maybe something that's happened to some of us with our wives. And if there's any wives in the audience, I saw a couple of ladies walking around earlier, but hopefully if it's just guys, we'll just be honest with ourselves for a minute. Has your wife ever had to leave the house? And as they're leaving, maybe they got to run out and they've got to do some errands. And they say, I need you to do this one thing. You ever heard that? Here's the one thing I need you to do. Dishes. Maybe it's dishes. Maybe it's something simple like that. Maybe it's laundry. Hey, could you get the laundry done? Hey, could you pick up some things? It could be small things like that. It could be a big thing. Hey, make sure your son doesn't go down the stairs on his slide again. Okay? That could be one big thing. And you see her leave. And you start thinking about, but I've got to do these things if we do it, right? If we do anything. And we could do everything in the house, right? We could rebuild a wall. We could move carpets in. We could paint everything. We might or might not keep our son from going down the stairs on his sleigh. And I just want to say he's fine, if you're wondering. He did fine. But you might do everything else. And she's going to walk in, and if we haven't done that one thing, what's she going to say? I asked you to do one thing, right? That's the thing you're going to hear. She's going to notice it. It was the one thing. Now we could think, but I did all these other things and they were good and they were great. But what we don't understand is maybe that was the one thing she needed us to do to get the rest of the things done around the house, right? That's kind of how I see God right now when he's speaking to these Israelites. He's been with them. He's given them this command to go back to start working on the temple. And he looks down and as he's talking and he gives this word to Haggai, he says, but wait a minute. You haven't done it. You haven't done it. He says, my house is in ruin. The temple is in ruin still, yet you are living in your paneled houses. What do you think caused that? Well, if we look at the book of Ezra gives us some context. Because if we just jump in here, it doesn't seem like it makes sense. I mean, why is he so mad? This is how the chapter begins. It's how the book really kind of jumps off. And so you're going, why is he mad at them? When we get to the time of Ezra actually accounts for some of the things that happened during this time. One of the things that happened is they were blessed to be able to go back. Thanks to Cyrus, they were able to go back. And they were even given access to some lumber with the understanding, it was that thought that they would use that to first rebuild the temple. But there's a problem here. Some of the Samaritans in that area were not happy that they were rebuilding the temple. So they began to attack, they harass them, they threaten them. All of these things start to happen, and so they kind of shrink back from that. And they begin to work on their houses. Do you see why God's a little bit upset right now? He said, I wanted you to do this one thing, the thing that binds the community together. I want you to do that one thing. But they start focusing on totally different things. And in fact, out of fear, they take the blessing that they have from God, the access to the lumber, the freedom to be there, and instead they start using it to build their houses. Now here's the thing. This is an action of fear. They didn't want to rock the neighborhood. They didn't want to make the neighbors mad anymore, so they stopped building. Now, I don't know about you, but that sounds like some church board meetings to me if you've ever sat in one. Things are finally good. We've had a time of peace. Things are great. We're excited about things, but could we just not rock the boat right now? I know, maybe we should be doing this. God's blessed us with this, but could we just not rock the boat right now? And I'm guilty of it, guys. I don't know if some of you have ever sat in that position, if you've ever been in leadership or been a part of a church and you've had some moments where you just didn't want to rock the boat. And you see, it wasn't that they did bad things. I mean, they built their houses. They were back in that area. They were trying to reestablish. It wasn't that they were necessarily doing bad things, but they weren't doing what God asked them to do out of fear. And I think for some of us, we do that sometimes, don't we? In our walk with Christ. Those things he calls us to give faithfully, to love others, to reach out, to share his word. There are times where out of fear, we don't necessarily do things that are wrong, but maybe we don't do what he was asking as a result. Specifically, we think, well, maybe I won't do this, but I will do this. Is that good enough? But here's the thing. God calls us, back in Isaiah 41, he says, don't be fearful. Don't live in fear. For those that have lived in fear, those that have gone by that, who have trapped themselves in this way, as we get to verse 5, he begins to tell the Israelites what the results of living in that kind of fear are. By not being obedient, by not doing what he calls, and this is what he says. He says, now this is what the Lord Almighty says, give careful thought to your ways. You have planted much, but harvest little. You eat, but you never have enough. You drink, but you never have your fill. You put on clothes, but are not warm. You earn wages only to put them in a purse with holes in it. What's God saying here? God's saying because you were crippled by your fear, because you didn't follow through with what I called you to do, then there is a lack of blessing that I am releasing to you. And we don't want to think about God withholding, do we? He's a gracious God. He's a loving God. But would he ever withhold? And here's the thing. When we look at this story in particular, it's very, very clear that there are times God withholds when we are not faithful out of fear. That's hard for us to hear, especially when we think we're still doing the right thing, but maybe just not exactly like he asked us to do. And he tells the Israelites that he is withholding and that they've lived by this crippling fear. And the problem for us is it can be the same thing for us. We'd like to think it won't be. We'd like to think that would never happen to us. We'll never make that kind of mistake. But even as we go into the New Testament, Jesus talks about the parable of the talents, and he talks about those that he would give and what he would take away from those that didn't do anything with it, and how he would give it to those that were doing something with it. That is still alive and well, even in the church today. If we don't follow through with what he calls us to do, then he will use it in another way, because his will not be disrupted. And we can either be part of that and have the courage to follow through with it, or we can live by the crippling fear that Satan wants to bring the church down with. Just honestly. So crippling fear is not something God called us to live by. But I also want to give us a word of encouragement. And that's this, that there is a way to harness that fear. There's a way to harness that fear. And thank goodness he didn't leave the Israelites where they were and just said, there's no hope for you. You can't do anything. No, he challenged them. He didn't leave them where they were, but he did it through showing them how they had been living by fear and fear alone. And as we go into the second chapter of Haggai, there's something that's really important to realize here. He begins to call out to them, to get them to change course. And this is what he says. He says in verse 15 through 19. He says, now give careful thought to this from this day on. Consider how things were before one stone was laid on another in the Lord's temple. When anyone came to a heap of 20 measures, there were only 10. When anyone went to a wine vat to draw 50 measures, there were only 20. I struck all the work of your hands with blight, mildew, and hail. Yet you did not return to me, declares the Lord. From this day on, from this 24th day of the 9th month, give careful thought to the day when the foundation of the Lord's temple was laid. Give careful thought. Is there yet any seed left in the barn? Until now, the vine and the fig tree, the pomegranate and the olive tree have not bore fruit. From this day on, I will bless you. What's he doing here? It's interesting because at the beginning of this, there's obviously a time that has passed. And we know that they kind of take Haggai's word and they begin to shift. But what happened? He had to show them how they were living in fear. When he gets to chapter 2, he says, let me remind you what it was like when you were living in fear. I was withholding my blessing. And he goes through all that again. He wants to remind them. He says, consider this, take this to thought, pay attention. He says, when you were living by fear, I was withholding the blessing. But when they followed through, when they began to have the courage, when they stepped out, he began to bless them. He says, I will bless you from this day forth. Because they were willing to be faithful. They were willing to be courageous to fight against that fear. Now, in looking at these two changes, this is where we harness fear just a little bit. It may hurt to look at our failures. They're a result of our fear. You know, that time we didn't talk to somebody that maybe we were led to talk to. That moment where we didn't pick up the phone and call that brother or sister that was hurting. Or that moment where we didn't follow through with his plan for his church because we wanted to please just a couple of people or a handful of people. Here's the thing. That failure hurts, but it also leaves a reminder. Have you ever noticed that? If you think about your life, whether it's physical or it's a spiritual or emotional event, if you failed at something, you will remember it. It may leave a scar, and it may be painful, and I'm sure God wants them to understand, yes, it was painful when you didn't do what I said, when you didn't follow through in faith. But it was also a reminder to them of what it was before then, when they lived by fear and fear alone. Remember that platform I was on? As I stood on that platform that day, I felt like a failure. I thought I've let all of these students down that I've been challenging all week. But here's the thing. I had a whole year to think about that. The next year, the week went the same way. We had a great time, and we made our trek up that mountain, and I had it in my mind at some level, I may not do this again. But instead of being crippled by fear, I began to think about what that student said to me that first year and how it just kind of sucked the life out of that week. And I jumped out on that platform, and there was another student that was afraid, that was scared just like I was, and I saw the trembling them, and I basically told the zipliner, hook us up now and push us. Just push us, get us out, get it done. And sure enough, he hooked us up as fast as he could, which looking back now, that could have been dangerous, but we went with it. He hooked me up as fast as he could, and I said, I'm not gonna do this, I'm gonna do this, I'm not gonna do this. Finally, he just pushed me. And we went, and me and the other student, we yelled all the way down, but we made it, and we had this amazing time, and everybody was cheering because of that. And here's what's crazy. As we got off, one by one, those students came off the zip line behind me, and we had all made this connection that we had done something together. We had the same courage, we had the same plan and the same dream. Even though we had fear, it pushed us, and what pushed me was my first failure. I didn't want to experience that again. For the Israelites, God was reminding them, don't be defined by that failure, but harness that failure. Use that fear. Maybe you look back and you remember that fear or the time that you failed when you didn't follow through. But don't be defined by it. Let it push you. Let it push you to do something much bigger. Because I think right now more than ever, God is waiting for His church to do big things, even in the face of fear. Because we live in a fearful time, but He's got big plans for us. So the question is, what are we going to do? You know, the great thing for us is we get to look back at this story. For the Israelites, they finished the temple. Years later, Nehemiah builds the wall. God's people begin to be faithful, and He blesses them. For us, we get to look back at this story. And maybe we can't think of those failures we've had that push us. But the great thing for us as believers, as followers of Christ, when we study the Word over and over again, He reminds us what He will do if we will be faithful in the face of fear. So here's the question I want to leave us with tonight. Are we going to be crippled by our fear? Or are we going to change course? Are we going to be part of changing history for what God has planned for His church? Nobody can make you jump off the ledge that He's calling you to, whatever it may be. But I can guarantee you He will give you the courage to do it if you simply ask.